The word introvert, as we understand it today, didn't exist until 1921. Before that, there was no widely recognized term for the person who preferred books to parties, who recharged alone rather than in crowds, who thought before speaking. For thousands of years, these people walked the earth without this particular framework for understanding what they were. Then a Swiss psychiatrist had a falling out with Sigmund Freud, and in trying to understand why their friendship imploded, he accidentally created one of the most powerful personality concepts of the modern age. Today, calling yourself an introvert feels as natural as stating your eye color. We take personality quizzes, build dating profiles around it, structure our work lives to accommodate it. The concept has become so embedded in how we understand ourselves that it's shocking to realize how recent this framework actually is. Your great-grandparents lived in a world where introvert wasn't a word you could look up in the dictionary with its modern psychological meaning. But here's what's fascinating. The traits we associate with introversion have always existed. Shakespeare wrote introverted characters. Ancient philosophers described people who turned inward for wisdom. The behavior was there, but the framework for understanding it wasn't. And when that framework finally arrived, it didn't come from careful observation of human nature. It came from one man's attempt to make sense of a professional breakup that shattered his world. The story of how introvert entered our vocabulary reveals something profound about how we create the language we use to understand ourselves. It shows us that the categories we think are natural and obvious are actually recent inventions shaped by specific historical moments and personal conflicts, and it explains why, even a century later, we're still arguing about what introversion actually means. To understand how we got the word introvert, we need to start with two men in a richly decorated apartment in Vienna in February 1907. Carl Jung, 31 years old, had traveled from Switzerland to meet the famous Sigmund Freud, who was 51 and already the founder of psychoanalysis. When they sat down to talk, something extraordinary happened. They talked for 13 straight hours. Freud had been looking for an intellectual equal, someone who could understand and extend his work. Jung seemed perfect. He was brilliant, ambitious, fascinated by dreams and the unconscious mind. Freud began treating him with unusual favor, considering him his successor and intellectual heir. For 6 years, they were inseparable collaborators, exchanging hundreds of letters, building the foundations of modern psychology together. But by 1913, their relationship had completely collapsed. The details of their split involved complex disagreements about the nature of the unconscious, the role of sexuality in human behavior, and the boundaries of scientific inquiry. Jung had begun developing ideas that Freud found mystical and unscientific. Freud accused Jung of abandoning rational analysis for spiritual speculation. Jung felt Freud was reducing all human behavior to sexual impulses. The breakup devastated both men, but it hit Jung particularly hard. He fell into what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological turmoil that lasted several years. He experienced vivid dreams, heard voices, had visions. He questioned everything he thought he knew about the human mind. During this crisis, Jung began developing the theory that would give us the word introvert. He was trying to understand not just why he and Freud had disagreed, but why they disagreed so fundamentally that their friendship became impossible. The answer, he decided, lay in recognizing that people have fundamentally different psychological orientations. Jung noticed that Freud seemed energized by external stimulation, by social interaction, by engaging with the outer world of people and events. Jung himself was different. He was energized by solitude, by reflection, by turning inward toward thoughts and ideas. This wasn't just a preference, Jung realized. It was a basic difference in how their psychological energy flowed. In 1921, Jung published Psychological Types, the book that introduced the concepts of introversion and extroversion in their modern psychological sense. But here's the crucial detail. Jung didn't invent the word introvert from scratch. The word had existed in English since the 1660s, but it had a completely different meaning. It was a technical term used in anatomy and biology to describe organs or body parts that turned or folded inward, like the way certain animals retract parts of their bodies. Jung took this spatial metaphor and applied it to psychological energy. An introvert, in Jung's original formulation, was someone whose psychic energy naturally flowed inward toward the inner world of thoughts, feelings, and ideas. An extrovert's energy flowed outward, toward the external world of people, activities, and objects. This wasn't about being shy or antisocial. Jung himself was quite social when he chose to be. It was about the fundamental direction of psychological energy, about where you naturally turn to recharge and make sense of the world. But Jung's careful distinctions got lost almost immediately. By the 1930s, American psychologists had begun using introvert and extrovert in ways Jung never intended. They turned his nuanced theory about energy flow into simple categories about social behavior. Introverts became the shy, quiet ones. Extroverts became the outgoing, talkative ones. This transformation wasn't accidental. It reflected a massive cultural shift happening in early 20th century America. Historian Warren Sussman identified this as the move from a culture of character to a culture of personality. In the 19th century, what mattered was your inner moral character, your integrity, your ability to persist through hardship. But as America urbanized and industrialized, as people increasingly worked in large organizations and lived among strangers, what mattered became your ability to make a good impression, to be likable, to stand out in a crowd. The concept of personality, as we understand it today, became widespread in the 18th and 19th centuries, but the idea of having a good personality wasn't widespread until the 20th century. Self-help books before 1920 focused on developing character traits like discipline and honor. After 1920, they focused on developing personality traits like charm and magnetism. In this new cultural context, Jung's introversion looked like a problem to be solved. If success depended on your ability to impress others, then turning inward seemed like a handicap. Popular psychology began treating introversion as a mild form of social dysfunction, something that could be overcome with the right techniques and enough effort. This misunderstanding was reinforced by the way personality research developed in American universities. Psychologists wanted to measure personality scientifically, which meant reducing Jung's complex theory to simple questionnaires. They created tests that asked things like, do you enjoy parties? And do you prefer reading to socializing? The rich psychological theory became a crude sorting mechanism. Hans Eysenck, a German-born British psychologist, played a crucial role in this transformation. Starting in the 1950s, he developed influential personality theories and tests that treated introversion and extroversion as opposite ends of a single spectrum. You were either one or the other, with no middle ground. His research became hugely influential, but it fundamentally changed what these terms meant. Eysenck's version of introversion focused on what he called arousal levels. Introverts, he argued, had higher baseline arousal in their nervous systems, which made them more sensitive to stimulation. They preferred quieter environments because they were already operating at a higher internal energy level. Extroverts had lower baseline arousal, so they sought out stimulating environments to reach their optimal functioning level. This biological explanation was compelling, but it was different from Jung's original idea about the direction of psychological energy. Jung had been talking about where you naturally focus your attention. Eysenck was talking about how much stimulation you can handle. These are related but distinct concepts, and the confusion between them persists today. Meanwhile, something interesting was happening in the dictionary. When Merriam-Webster added introvert to their unabridged dictionary in 1934, their definition reflected Jung's original meaning: interest directed inward, a propensity finding one's satisfaction in the inner life of thought and fancy. But by the 1960s, dictionary definitions had shifted towards the social interpretation, someone who is shy, reserved, or antisocial. The word had drifted from its origins, carried along by cultural currents that Jung never anticipated. What started as a theory about psychological energy became a theory about social behavior. What started as a neutral description became a value judgment about what kinds of people were more successful or desirable. But the story doesn't end with this misunderstanding. In recent decades, we've seen a remarkable rehabilitation of introversion driven by new research and changing cultural values. Scientists have discovered that introversion involves real neurological differences. Brain imaging studies show that introverts have more activity in their prefrontal cortex, the area associated with planning and internal processing. They also show different patterns of neurotransmitter sensitivity, with introverts being more sensitive to acetylcholine, which is linked to contemplation and introspection. This research has helped restore some of Jung's original insight. Introversion isn't a social deficit, it's a different way of processing information and energy. Introverts aren't failed extroverts any more than left-handed people are failed right-handed people. They're operating with a different neurological setup that has its own advantages and challenges. The cultural rehabilitation of introversion accelerated with Susan Cain's 2012 book, Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. Cain argued that modern society systematically undervalues introverted traits, despite the fact that introverts are responsible for many of our greatest innovations and insights. She pointed out that everyone from Einstein to Gandhi to J.K. Rowling identified as introverts. But even this positive reframing reveals how much the word has changed from Jung's original conception. When people today say, "I'm an introvert," they usually mean something about their social preferences or energy management strategies. They rarely mean what Jung meant, that their psychological energy naturally flows toward the inner world of thoughts and ideas. This evolution raises fascinating questions about how language shapes self-understanding. The word introvert has become a tool that millions of people use to make sense of their experience, to explain why certain situations drain them while others energize them, to justify their need for solitude in a culture that often values constant connectivity. But the word they're using carries a century of accumulated meanings, some of which contradict each other. The biological introvert who needs less stimulation isn't necessarily the same as the psychological introvert whose energy flows inward, who isn't necessarily the same as the social introvert who prefers smaller gatherings. We've collapsed distinct concepts into a single term, creating both clarity and confusion. The result is that introvert has become what linguists call a folk category, a word that feels scientifically precise but actually reflects popular understanding more than technical definition. Like depression or trauma, it's a term that has migrated from professional psychology into everyday language, changing meaning along the way. This isn't necessarily a problem. Language evolves, and the fact that millions of people have found the concept of introversion useful suggests it's meeting a real need. The word has given people permission to honor their own temperaments, to stop trying to be something they're not, to find strategies that work with their natural inclinations rather than against them. But it's worth remembering that the categories we use to understand ourselves are human inventions, not natural laws. The word introvert didn't exist in its modern form for most of human history, yet introverted people certainly did. They found other ways to understand and explain their temperaments, other frameworks for making sense of their place in the world. Jung created the word introvert to solve a personal puzzle about why his friendship with Freud had failed so catastrophically. He couldn't have predicted that his attempt to understand one relationship would eventually give millions of people a new way to understand themselves. The word took on a life of its own, evolving through decades of research and cultural change, accumulating meanings Jung never intended while losing some he considered essential. Today, when someone says, "I'm an introvert," they're invoking a century of psychological theory, cultural anxiety about personality, and ongoing scientific research about how brains work differently. They're also participating in the very human project of trying to capture something essential about inner experience with the crude tools of language. The word may be only 100 years old, but the search for self-understanding it represents is as old as consciousness itself.